Have you ever wondered if the person you just promised to spend the rest of your life with is actually a total stranger? Imagine the music has stopped, the guests have gone home, and the heavy doors of the bridal suite have finally clicked shut. You are standing there in your white dress, expecting the happiest night of your life, but instead you feel a cold shiver down your spine. What if the man you just married won't even look you in the eye? This is the story of Sarah and David, a couple whose perfect wedding night turned into a mystery that would change their lives forever. As we go through this emotional journey, pay close attention to the words and phrases we use, as this is a powerful way to improve your English through storytelling. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah sat on the edge of the velvet-covered bed, her fingers trembling as she reached for the zipper of her gown. She expected David to help her, as he had promised during their photo shoots, but he was standing by the window, staring out at the dark city skyline. He looked like a statue, frozen in a tuxedo that suddenly felt like a costume. Why was he so distant? Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, but the words felt stuck. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, she noticed something strange on the bedside table. It was a small, weathered wooden box that hadn't been there when they checked in earlier that afternoon. Where did it come from, and who had left it for them? Curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when mixed with fear. Sarah reached out and touched the cool wood of the box. David didn't move. He seemed lost in a world she couldn't enter. She slowly lifted the lid, expecting perhaps a late wedding gift or a romantic note. Instead, her heart skipped a beat. Inside was a single, crumpled piece of paper and a rusted key. The paper had only 5 words written on it. "He is not who you think." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Who could have sent this? And more importantly, why did David look so guilty without even seeing the note? She looked at the back of his head, the silhouette of her husband against the pale moonlight. Was it possible that the 3 years they spent dating were all a carefully constructed lie? She cleared her throat, her voice a mere whisper. "David," she said. He didn't turn around immediately. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. When he finally did turn, his face was half hidden in shadow, but she could see the glisten of tears in his eyes. This wasn't the face of a happy groom. It was the face of a man who was mourning. But who was he mourning for on their wedding night? He took a slow step toward her, but stopped at the foot of the bed, as if there were an invisible wall between them. "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking, "there are things about my family, things I thought I could leave in the past." He looked at the box in her hands, and his expression shifted from sadness to pure terror. How did that box get into a locked hotel room on the 20th floor? Sarah held the note up, her hand shaking. "What does this mean, David? Who wrote this?" David sank onto the floor, burying his face in his hands. He started to tell her about a brother she never knew existed, a twin who had disappeared 10 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He explained that his family had spent a fortune to keep the scandal quiet, to protect their reputation. But the key in the box belonged to an old cabin in the woods, a place where David used to hide when things got bad. But if his brother was gone, why was the key here now? The mystery was deepening, and Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of secrets. She looked at her wedding ring, the diamond sparkling in the dim light. It suddenly felt heavy, like a shackle around her finger. David told her that he had received a phone call just before the ceremony, a voice that sounded exactly like his own, telling him that the past was coming for him. He had spent the entire wedding day looking over his shoulder, terrified that a ghost would walk through the church doors. But why didn't he tell her? Why did he let her say, "I do," when he knew their lives were in danger? Sarah realized that trust is a fragile thing, easily broken but nearly impossible to mend. She stood up, the silk of her dress rustling in the quiet room. She walked to the window where David had been standing. The city below was full of lights, thousands of people living their lives, unaware of the drama unfolding in this single room. She felt a sudden surge of strength. She wasn't just a victim in this story, she was a partner. "We are going to that cabin," she said, her voice firm. David looked up, surprised by her resolve. He expected her to cry, to leave, to call for an annulment, but Sarah knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. They had to face the shadow together, but as they prepared to leave, a soft knock came at the door. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of room service or a bellhop. It was slow, deliberate, and chilling. Who would be visiting them at 2 in the morning? David stood up, his body tensing like a hunted animal. He moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Sarah held her breath, the rusted key clutched tightly in her palm. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. However, resting on the carpet was a single white rose, its petals stained with something dark and red. It wasn't ink, it was blood. The message was clear. They were being watched. Sarah felt a wave of nausea, but she forced herself to stay calm. They needed to leave the hotel immediately. They grabbed their coats, leaving the wedding finery behind. As they walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, every shadow seemed to move. The silence of the hotel felt predatory. They reached the elevator, and the wait for it to arrive felt like an eternity. When the doors finally opened, Sarah saw her reflection in the polished metal. She didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. The happy bride was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to fight for the truth. But as the elevator descended, the lights flickered and then went out completely. They were trapped in total darkness. Sarah could hear David's heavy breathing next to her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered in the dark. "I never wanted you to be part of this." She reached out and found his hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was tight. In that moment of darkness, she realized that she still loved him despite the lies, but was love enough to survive what was waiting for them at the cabin. The elevator jerked back to life, the lights buzzing as they reached the lobby. They hurried to the parking garage, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. The drive to the woods was silent. The trees outside the car window looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. As they pulled up to the old cabin, the moonlight revealed a structure that was rotting and overgrown. It looked like a place where secrets went to die. David turned off the engine, and the silence of the woods settled over them. Sarah looked at the rusted key in her hand. This was it, the moment of truth. They walked to the porch, the wood groaning under their weight. David put the key into the lock. It turned with a sickening click. The door swung open, revealing a room frozen in time. There were old newspapers on the floor, dust covering every surface. But in the center of the room, there was a table with 2 chairs. On the table were 2 plates of food, still steaming, as if someone had just sat down to dinner. Sarah felt a cold breeze blow through the open door, though there was no wind outside. Someone was here. Someone had been waiting for them. David called out a name Sarah had never heard before. "Julian," he whispered. From the shadows in the corner of the room, a figure emerged. He looked exactly like David, but his eyes were hollow and full of a strange, flickering light. It was the brother. He wasn't a ghost, and he hadn't disappeared. He had been hiding in plain sight, watching David live the life he felt he deserved. The confrontation that followed was a blur of emotion and revelations. Sarah listened as the 2 brothers argued about a past mistake. a choice made a decade ago that had fractured their family. She realized that David had been protecting his brother all this time, even at the cost of his own happiness. The lie wasn't one of malice, but one of a tragic, misplaced loyalty. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the forest, the tension finally broke. Julian turned away, disappearing back into the shadows of the woods, leaving the key and the box behind. David and Sarah stood on the porch, watching the dawn. The wedding night was over, and it had been nothing like they expected. But as the first rays of sunlight hit the cabin, Sarah realized that the truth, however painful, was better than a beautiful lie. They walked back to the car, exhausted but united. They had survived the night, and they had survived the secrets. Their marriage hadn't started with a fairy tale, but it had started with the truth. And in the end, isn't that what a real partnership is about? As they drove away from the cabin, Sarah looked at David. He looked tired, but the weight was gone from his shoulders. She took his hand, and this time he looked her right in the eyes. The lesson here is simple. Every story has two sides, and every person has a shadow. But when you face those shadows together, you find a strength you never knew you had. We hope this story helped you practice your English and gave you something to think about. Remember, language is about more than just words. It's about the emotions and the truths we share. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep seeking the truth in every story you hear.